My name is Dave Bambry, and I serve as the Vice President for Alumni and Student Engagement at your University of Illinois Alumni Association. I first want to thank everyone for joining us this evening as we're looking forward to another great session of our ongoing Alumni College Speaker Series. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I want to take just a moment to talk about some amazing things happening at the Alumni Association. In the past several weeks, the association has relaunched its paid membership model. We're very excited to bring this to our alumni, and I would encourage you to visit uiaa.org/membership to learn about the great benefits and to sign up today. Some of these expanded benefits include a partnership with the Krannert Center for the Performing Arts that will feature 2 member-only virtual performances each year, a chance to engage in career coaching, and discounts at the university bookstore, to name just a few. For those of you on the call who may be life members of the association, you are in a wonderful spot as you will be able to access these benefits today at no additional cost. We are certainly grateful for the investment that you have made into your membership, and we will honor that with our current suite of services and benefits. While we have introduced this paid membership model for those interested in our expanded benefits and offerings, we are still planning to have a lot of ways to engage at no cost. For example, our speaker series this evening will continue to be for all alumni, and other initiatives like our online networking and mentorship platform, Illini Link, will also continue as a no-cost benefit. If you haven't already checked out Illini Link, I encourage you to do so, and you can visit that platform by visiting illinilink.illinois.edu. We have a large number of alumni and students who have already signed up, and it is a great way to interact with those folks. Lastly, before I introduce our speaker this evening, I always like to remind everyone to please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We have left time at the end for questions, and we will do our very best to get to as many as possible with the time allotted. But let's get to why we are all here this evening, and that is to hear from a wonderful faculty member. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Dr. Emily Knox is Associate Professor in the School of Information Sciences, the iSchool at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Her research interests include information access, intellectual freedom and censorship, information ethics, information policy, and the intersection of print culture and reading practices. She is also a member of the Mapping Information Access Research Team. Emily recently co-edited Foundations of Information Ethics, published by American Library Associations. She also edited Trigger Warnings, History, Theory Context, published by Roman and Littlefield. Emily's book, Book Banning in 21st Century America, was published by the same company and is the first monograph in the Beta Phi Mu Scholar Series. Her next book, Foundations of Intellectual Freedom, will be published by American Library Associations in 2022. Emily received her PhD from the doctoral program at the Rutgers University School of Communications and Information, her master's in Library and Information Sciences from the iSchool here at Illinois, a BA in Religious Studies from Smith College, and an AM in the same field from the University of Chicago Divinity School. With that, and without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Emily Knox. Emily, thank you so much for being here with us this evening.
Thank you for inviting me. So hello, and thank you for that welcome. I do want to say just a little bit about myself. So while I was here studying to do library information science, I really thought I was going to be a public librarian in Chicago because I had just come from the University of Chicago and I really wanted to go back to Chicago. And I had worked for 2 years at Kirkland & Ellis, a law firm, as a project manager. But I ended up going to New York City and working in a theological library, which really helped me put together a lot of my different interests. However, even though I did that, I knew that I always wanted to go back to school and study why do people ban books. And that's what I'll be talking about today. So my mom was a high school librarian for 32 years. And we always celebrated Ban Books Week. So she would bring home posters, she would bring home the list of books that had been banned, we would look through them, and I would see that they were often books that I really loved. So I was especially fond of Judy Blume, and her books were always on this list. And as I went through my studies, I really wanted to understand what was the point of banning books, because I knew that they were on these lists, but yet I was still able to read them. So what I'm going to be talking about here today is really looking at why people ban books, but I do want to give some background. So we use this term intellectual freedom. When people ask me what I study intellectual freedom and censorship. But I'm well aware that the term intellectual freedom is kind of an inside baseball term that mostly only people in library and information sciences use. Other people tend to say things like free speech or censorship. They don't usually use this term intellectual freedom. But intellectual freedom is really a principle of librarianship. The way it's defined is that intellectual freedom is the right of every individual to both seek and receive information from all points of view without restriction. It provides for free access to all expressions of ideas through which any and all sides of a question, cause, or movement may be explored. Censorship is it's easiest to think of it as being the opposite. It's a suppression of ideas and information that certain persons, individuals, groups, or government officials find objectionable or dangerous. Now, these definitions are from the American Library Association. There are other definitions that you can find out around, but I like these definitions because they really focus on especially what is the effect of reading. What happens when you pick up a certain material? And that's really what my research focuses on. So this is not a narrow field. I try to tell people that intellectual freedom and censorship really encompasses many different areas. So if we start over here with philosophical issues, you heard that I edited a book on information ethics. Ethics, justice, morality, these are more the philosophical underpinnings of thinking about intellectual freedom and censorship. Legal, so there's lots about First Amendment law. That's not what I do, but it is to provide the legal structure for thinking about how intellectual freedom and censorship operate within our country. Also, more broadly, if we think about international law, when you're thinking about libraries that exist overseas, globally, you can think about, well, what are the legal structures that say what someone can or cannot access? Policy development, so the library itself has, the library profession develops these codes of ethics, the Library Bill of Rights, challenge policies, collection development policies, behavior policies, internet use policies. These all are often based in intellectual freedom. Privacy, so thinking about things like internet filtering, how do you handle records within any sort of organization? So things like how do you make sure that people feel like they are not being watched or surveyed when they are wanting to look for certain types of information? But what I really focus on, and what I'll focus on today, is just a general broad term that I call access. So how do we select books in public institutions? How do we classify those books? How do we decide where they go on the shelf? How do we think about people who challenge that we collected a book, or that it's on the shelf, or that it's in the school curriculum? And with this is this issue of bibliography, and bibliography is very important for librarianship. So when I was talking about when I was growing up with my mom, and she would bring home the list, those are actually bibliographies. They tell us which books have been banned through time, and for what reasons. So it's very important, just as a history of the cultural record, to think about the books that have been banned through time and how they have affected our thinking about ideas. Now, you'll notice I'm focusing really on books here, but of course, intellectual freedom is about much more than books. I do talk about things like internet policy. When I'm involved in some of my other work, we talk about things like art, we talk about protest movements, but this is really going to be focused on my main love, which is books. So, one thing is, of course, this title of this talk was called Why Ban Books? But I actually do not talk much about banning books because it's a little bit too narrow. Instead, I talk about things like book challenges and what I call censorship practices. So people often ask me, is censorship wrong? And I try to get people to think more broadly. What do you mean by censorship? How are you defining that? So I think about censorship as not just one thing, but a constellation of practices that we engage in. So these can be passive practices, so something like self-censorship or not collecting something because of bias. These can be active practices, and I use the 4 R's for this. So this is redaction, restriction, relocation, and removal. And I'll go through each of those in turn. So redaction is basically when you mark through a word, an image, but the whole material still stays up. We also see this in film, where you see things blurred out. That would be a form of redaction. Restriction basically means that you have put some sort of barrier to access up. So often this will be something like a permission slip, or even like on a very high shelf so that people can't find it, not in the right place. So this is restriction. Relocation takes a little bit more effort to define, but basically relocation means that the material has been removed from access by the audience for whom it was intended. So that last part is very important because it's not simply that it's been removed, it's that the audience for whom the book, we'll just use book, was intended no longer has access to it. So for example, the way this happens in libraries is that somebody will say, okay, well, this book is not actually a young adult book. It's actually an adult book, even though the author intended for it to be a book for young adults. Now, I hope you can see how these are very often unclear demarcations. What designates someone as a young adult versus an adult? This gets very important when we talk about thinking about how libraries operate and how do we know what kind of materials our patrons want. Removal is what most people think of as being censorship. So this is when something is completely removed from a collection, from the curriculum, from the school, from the school library, from the public library. This is removal. So the 4 R's again are redaction, restriction, relocation, and removal. So I also think about models of censorship. This really helps me understand who is doing the censoring. So you can have something like state-sponsored censorship. If you look at the history of censorship, you see things like the royal privilege, the idea that in order to publish something, you had to have permission from the monarch. Institutional censoring, this would be something like school internet filtering, or for example, the index of prohibited books that was put out by the Roman Catholic Church for over 300 years. Actually 400 years. So then there's the individual censorship, but often individuals use their symbolic power, and I'll come back to what I mean by that, within the state to enact censorship, to engage in censorship practices. So this is saying something like, well, I'm a taxpayer, so I have a say over what's going on. So I study something I call the discourse of censorship. Basically, what this means is in our world, in our country, where we are very attached to our ideas of freedom, how do we justify removing access to materials? So I look at relationships among power, identity, and how we think of knowledge to talk about things like the status of public institutions in our communities, how people think about how these public institutions operate, how do the books get on the shelf, but most importantly for me is reading practices. So this is actually a picture of McMinn County School Board. This is right after Mouse was removed, so this is from February 10th of this year, and you can see how many people are actually in this boardroom. Probably we can't see the spillover out the door, but you can see that this is a very important topic that people get very passionate about. So I noted that I don't talk about book banning. What we talk about in library and information science is book challenges. So these are challenges to library materials. They can also be challenges to school curriculum materials. Basically, this is how they work. A particular material, a book is identified. The person is asked to fill out a request for reconsideration form. I'll show you what those look like. There's often a meeting with either the library or their school staff. If it's not resolved, it's sent to the board. There's sometimes a hearing. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is from Stockton, Missouri, and Mike Holtzneck is actually talking about The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie, and I love that he has brought his exhibits. He's an attorney, and he has blown up the pictures that he doesn't like, and he's actually talking to an extremely full high school gym about this book and why it is a problem. So I'm interested in this because it seems like a very strange thing to do, to say, I don't want this book here, when you know that the book can be accessed in many different ways. So you can get it from Amazon, you can borrow it from a friend, sometimes it's in the library down the road, you can interlibrary loan it, you can torrent it. There are all sorts of ways to get this material. So what is the point? What is the point of this? And I really understand this in the realm of the symbolic. It's not actually about the book. It's actually much more about how we think about reading and community values. So this is just a quick overview of the theories that I use for my work. I am highly indebted to Bourdieu, who's in the middle there, really about his ideas about practice. So I talked about censorship practices, just thinking about how do we actually do things when there are structures around us that keep from doing anything we want to do, and also we have our own inner sense of what we want to do. So that's just an easy way of thinking about what Bourdieu is thinking about here. I use social construction because I'm very interested in language, how people use language to justify getting rid of books. And here I talk a little bit about these ideas of symbolic capital. So that would be saying things like, I'm a taxpayer. Symbolic power, how you use that power as a taxpayer. Symbolic violence is a kind of strange word, but it's basically about classification. So when I was talking about moving a book from young adult to the adult section, that's actually a form of symbolic violence. Only certain people are able to do that, right? Librarians can move those books. How do you pressure people to say, this thing is classified incorrectly and should be classified in the way I want it to be classified? The other thing I think about a lot are reading practices. So I'm interested in how reading has changed over time, and I really bring in a lot of my religious studies to think about this. So I'm interested in how we lost some ideas about how interpretation of text works. So for example, in the Middle Ages, there was interpretive frameworks for interpreting scripture, the so-called four senses of scripture, and any discrepancy between scripture types. So if you were reading different gospels, for example, those could be seen as being different types of interpretations. Also, the practice of silent reading, this developed over time. People didn't start reading silently at first. They read out loud, often with a group of people. So one person would read out loud to other people, which actually provides a method for others to intervene and say, well, this is what this text means, right? If someone is reading it out loud, then you know what the text means. Silent reading is quite different. You don't know what someone is actually reading, and you don't know how they're interpreting it. So I will tell you a little bit about how this shows up. What happens is that a parent will say, I saw my child reading this, and I could see that they were embarrassed. So you don't actually know what the child is saying or thinking in their head because they're reading silently. But in fact, this can be a catalyst for a book being identified as being problematic. So in the early modern era, this is the Reformation. We see a rise in what is called sola scriptura, the idea that you can rely on scripture alone to save your soul. Now, that might seem totally out there. What does it have to do with banning books? But in fact, we say things like reading is fundamental. Reading is something that is so important that if I want you to change your mind about something, often what I do is give you something to read. That's not coincidental. It's actually an idea that has been passed down to us through time with the Reformation. The idea that we can use the text to become a different person. Finally, I look at what I call common sense interpretation. This is linked to Scottish common sense philosophy, and it's basically the idea that text is self-evident, right? So, you know, we hold these truths self-evident. That's actually from Scottish common sense philosophy, and it's the idea that you can know what that text means. And in fact, there's only one meaning for the text. Not multiple meanings for the text, but only one meaning is possible, and there are no hidden meanings. So when I'm doing my research, my animations aren't going to work, but basically what I do is for the book that I wrote, I interviewed challengers directly to see how they talked about their own challenge cases. I've actually been to challenge hearings, so I showed the picture of the McMinn County. I've actually gone to those. I take observer notes and really to get a feel of what it's like to be there. And the other thing is I do FOIA requests. So I do Freedom of Information Act requests to the public institutions to request their open records. So this is what I would get back in that situation. This is pretty typical. This is actually from the Katy ISD, which has been back in the news again. There's always things happening at Katy ISD in, that's an independent school district in Texas. So this was against the hate you give. And this is a basic request for reconsideration form. The parents were upset about this book. And actually there are some common arguments within here. So they say that the book should only be read by people who are over the age of 17. because it's being made into the film, and the film will be rated R, and rated R movies are for people who are over the age of 17. Most importantly, they say at the bottom, we see no literary value to this book, which is just a very kind of complete and way of summarizing how they feel about this book. Actually, they gave many different pages and pages of notes of the different places that they felt the book was inappropriate. So you can see they say, please see attached excerpts with the book where the book highlights. So this is just a quick overview of how I do my analysis. So basically, I look at these reading practices. So this is just to say that there are knowledge effects. Also, you can see here with the reading aloud, this is a common argument that's given, that you shouldn't include a book if people aren't comfortable with reading it aloud. And that, here's another example. So this is institutional, so people are asking for opting out of reading. So remember I said with restriction. Also, I really also look at diverse books. So one thing I found using Chimamanda Adichie's argument is that there's often an argument that one book can be substituted for another book very easily. So that's what you see here, that these options provide comparable learning experiences. And this is about The Bluest Eye, which was actually recently banned in Missouri. So more broadly, I look at ideas that seem to be part of challengers' ideas overall. So childhood innocence, I actually found that there are two different ways that challengers think about innocence. So they either think about it in terms of that children are a clean slate, and reading something immoral will put these bad ideas in them, or that books are triggering and that the bad character is already within children but will come out if they read these books. So you'll notice that I'm not actually mentioning all the time which books these are necessarily, because I'm much more interested in this broader view of how people think about them. So I really like this one about the limits and guidelines for behavior, the idea of acting immorally without consequences. The designers of our Constitution realized this. And that if we don't have moral guides, codes, and guidelines, once again, chaos is the end result. Now, this catastrophizing actually happens for challengers of all types, that the book actually becomes the catalyst for all sorts of terrible things that might happen in the world. So what did I find? Basically, challengers are incredibly concerned about society, both on a national and a local level. They are really concerned that society is fragile and can be easily disrupted. There's a sense of decline, a sense of moral drift within society. Often challengers, from any political point of view, feel like they are on the side of minority and on the side of morality. So they are both a minority who is on the side of morality. And they often use the language of spiritual warfare to talk about this. I found a lot about parenting. So the concern of challengers is often that they are very involved in their children's lives, but they know that there are parents who work 2 jobs, who are unable, for example, to be as involved in their children's lives. And so public institutions like schools and libraries should provide support for those parents, and by ensuring that things that other parents might find objectionable are not included in collections or curriculum. I talked a little bit about childhood innocence. One of the main things is that it must be protected at all costs. So I just love talking about libraries. So I was really curious as to how challengers think about libraries. For many people, and this is not surprising, libraries are somewhat magical places. And in fact, when you find a book that is disturbing in some way, that magic gets questioned. So what I see is that people will say things like, well, I don't know how the book got there, right? Who made the decision? How did it get there? And the library is a place where you should be safe. Now, safe means different things to different people, but that is how libraries are thought of, and especially, not surprising, how schools are thought of. But the procedures that are used to get books in curriculum, to get books on libraries and any other materials are completely opaque. Also, and I think this is very important, libraries are seen as symbols of the community. So having a good library that reflects the values of the community is very important. Finally, reading practices. So it's actually difficult to think about like how to think about reading. I just really love these art books that show imagination that pops out from the page. This is kind of how we think about reading. So I do find that people who challenge books believe that there's only one interpretation of the text and that they know what that interpretation is and what the effects of it will be. The words on the page mean what they say and say what they mean. They also worry that there are people who have what Kathy Davison calls undisciplined imagination. That is, they lack what you might think of as critical distance from a text. So they get all involved in the text and they are unable to control their emotions when they read the text. There's a lot about imaginative visualization and mimesis, so mimicking what you read. If you read about kids doing drugs, you'll do drugs. That's basically how a lot of thoughts about how we read come out when I look at this discourse of censorship. There's also concern about short and long-term effects. So this is a causal argument, basically a slippery slope. So if you read a book about drugs, you might do drugs. If you read a book that is about people of immoral character, however you define that, you will eventually have immoral character. So these are books that have been showing up recently. Some of these have actually been on the ALA challenge books list for a very long time. Some of these are brand new, but Drama and later Gator and I Am Jazz have been on the list a very long time, but these are the ones that are in the news right now. This is a recent letter from the Moms for Liberty. So what I think about challenging books, book challenges represent the movement of a private act determining what your own children or what you should read into the public sphere. And it's really based on how challengers think about the public sphere. That is, it should be a symbolic representation of their own values within the community. So a community's public institutions should reflect their own values and beliefs. Since they are supported by the community, and in some respects are the public face of the community, institutions within the public sphere should only contain carefully selected and ordered knowledge. The discourse of censorship can be understood as a discourse of both anxiety about what is happening to society, and action. How do I respond to what is happening in society? It focuses on why certain types of knowledge should not be made available to a particular population and are rooted in many different spheres. Challengers employ arguments from religious and scientific domains, as well as a foundation regarding the power of books and reading. The common sense interpretive strategy, that I call it, is rooted in our historical ideas about what reading can do for someone. They also use this language of spiritual warfare. So this is actually my favorite ALA Banned Books Week poster. And I really like it because I think it summarizes why people ban books. It's that words have power. Books have power. We believe as a society that reading is fundamental. I also do some work on how the book itself, the object, the codex, can be seen as a sacred object for many people. So sometimes what I'll ask my students is, I want a raise of hands of how many of you break the spines on your book? And I just leave it there. I don't ask them to actually, and some people have horrified looks. I would never break the spine on a book. Now the book is a mass manufactured object, but still they are treated as sacred objects. So basically, why do people ban books? Because words have power, books have power. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Emily, thank you so much. I think my mic is on again, so thank you for a wonderful presentation. We already have a ton of great questions in the Q&A here, so we'll jump right into that, but certainly want to encourage questions to continue to come in. We've got about 20 minutes for our Q&A portion here, so we'll have some time to get through a number of those. So feel free to submit those at the bottom of your screen in the Q&A function if you haven't done so already. But let's jump right in because we've got some great stuff to talk about here. First question right off the top, this one came in early. BC asks, what topics or subjects are most often banned or censored?
So that's a good question, and actually it changes over time. Book challenges and book bannings have happened for a very long time. And basically, they follow whatever the anxieties are in society. So, for example, during the 50s, books on communism were banned. In the early 80s, books on the satanic panic and the occult were banned. Right now, what we're seeing is that almost all of the books that are being challenged across the country are books that we call diverse books. So these are books that are about underrepresented minorities of various types, and I usually use the We Need Diverse Books movement, their definition, which includes different racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQIA folks, people with mental illness, so all sorts of diverse books. And that's what we see as being challenged right now.
Great, thank you. Do you have an idea what percentage of these challenges are actually successful, and what causes challenges to succeed or fail?
So we don't know how many of them are successful. Actually, challenges are reported, we assume, by about 90%. So let me give some background on why we think that. Most challenges are not formal, so we don't actually receive the form. No one calls the LA and says, I got a challenge today. What actually happens quite a bit is the books or the films or the artwork disappears. And it's just not on the shelf anymore. We don't know how often that happens. So it's hard to say if they're successful, and it's also hard to know what successful means. So when I talk about the censorship practices, it's not necessarily that a book is removed, but it might be relocated. And you really have to look at each case very carefully to see what success or failure might mean.
So along those same lines, can books be reinstated once they are banned? And if so, how does that process work?
Yes, actually, we've seen several of the books that have been challenged right now get reinstated. Often, what happens is that there's an outcry from the community. And people ask me what to do if there is a challenge. And I say, if this is important to you, I encourage you to go to your board. If your kids have read this book, to have them testify themselves. It's civics in action. You will get better results if you are polite, as opposed to screaming and yelling. I can tell you that. In my book, I actually went to a hearing in North Carolina against Invisible Man, and actually I was at the hearing where they reversed their decision on removing the book from the curriculum.
Great. We've had a couple questions come in, kind of on age ranges. What's the most frequent age group that books are challenged for? And then you've talked a lot about children and the banning of books for children. Does this stretch across all age groups, or is this really focused on children mostly?
So actually, it's focused on children's of very particular age groups. Children who are between the ages of 4 and 6, and children who are between the ages of 14 to 17. And for any of you that are parents, this is not surprising. This is when children are moving to very definite, different stages of development. So moving from kindergarten to first grade, moving from middle school to high school. Also, the children themselves are at very different stages of development within their own cohort. So this is actually when we see this happen. These aren't the only time that books are challenged. Actually, there's quite a bit of work that shows that books for children and women are the books that are most likely to be censored. And this is because they are seen as having what I said was undisciplined imagination, not being able to keep themselves from being emotionally involved in the text. So if people are wondering about that, there's a reason why violent books that are often aimed at male audiences are not challenged. So thrillers, horror, those are rarely challenged within a public library. But erotica for adults does get challenged.
So we hear a lot about book banning and how it impacts students and the general public, but can you talk a little bit about how it impacts the authors whose books are banned? It's obviously, in this moment in time, I think bringing a lot of attention to that, but how has that kind of evolved over time? Do you have any insight on that?
It can actually be very disconcerting for authors. I was actually just watching a town hall, and the author of All Boys Aren't Blue was in it. He's actually been sued in the state of Louisiana. And, you know, a lot of the authors are not actually famous authors. They don't necessarily make a lot of money. They have to hire lawyers if something like that happens. So yes, there are books that sell more copies, but that's not always true. And it can be very disturbing to realize that there are so many people who are against your life, right? That's what people put into your life's work. That's what people put into writing. So it can be a very difficult process for some authors.
So we had the question come in from Linda, and I don't think you mentioned this as a part of your presentation, but when were the first books banned in the US? And she goes on to ask, are the most recent banned books really about race?
So the first books banned in the US would have been during the colonies, but I would say it really picked up with dime store novels and the question, the so-called fiction question. So naturalistic fiction has always been contested. So should a library have fiction at all? Fiction is untrue, right? It's a lie. It's not the truth. So books of those sorts were always contested. Also, comic books, books that are considered middle and lowbrow often are challenged or are banned in some way. The last book that was banned on a national level was Ulysses. So the question now is about race. So what we see now is really how will we respond to changes in our society? So I would say that books challenges are a lagging indicator. We now have a country where kids under 18 years old, a majority minority, how do we teach them? How do we tell them about their history? It will probably be different than the history that I learned, for example. And I like to use the example of Columbus Day when talking about that because it kind of takes it to a different realm. But Columbus Day was not a big deal when I was growing up. It was a day for sales. It was a day off of school. But recently, there have been discussions about should it be Indigenous Peoples Day? What actually happened when Columbus arrived? How do we talk about mass genocide in our country? How do we talk about westward expansion? This is a change that has happened in the past, 5-10 years. So that's actually what we see with books. There are now more books about people who are minorities, and we are not having as many books that what we call center white, heterosexual, male experiences. And those books have very different ways of speaking about life here in the United States, across the world. And when they come into communities, it can be jarring, right? They are a different way of thinking about how does our world operate. So yes, these books are about race, they're about gender, they're about sexuality, but they are really about the ways that our society is changing. Everybody doesn't agree with how our society is changing. And that's where we see the tension in these book challenges.
Okay, thank you. We had a question come in that said that there was a New York Times editorial this week. I'm not sure if you've read that or not, and they kind of flagged this and said if you haven't, maybe this isn't the best question, called Woke Librarians. I'm not sure if you've read that or perfect. Essentially, woke librarians condemning that for being one-sided in their concerns rather than being quote-unquote neutral. If you have read it, do you have an opinion on the piece and the fact that the New York Times chose to publish it at this moment in time?
Yeah, so actually I have not read this particular opinion piece, but I will talk a little about the neutrality principle and how intellectual freedom operates within librarianship. So like many other fields, librarianship has actually lots of different people within it. So when people talk about woke librarians, often they're talking about the librarians that are seen in the media, especially on Twitter. But librarians are all over the country in many different communities. So there are librarians who run storefront libraries in Alabama. There are librarians who run helicopter libraries in Alaska. These people live in very different communities than, say, the Chicago Public Library. So woke librarians is really a way of talking about how do we provide the best services to all members of our communities? And how do we actually mitigate harmful effects, if we think those exist, for various types of materials? That's actually quite hard to do. So the neutrality principle was basically saying librarians should be neutral. But in fact, librarians have never been neutral. Librarians have always supported intellectual freedom. And the argument I make is that you actually cannot imagine a different world without intellectual freedom. You have to have space to think about things like injustice, oppression, racism, if you don't have the space to do that, then you cannot imagine a different world. And that can only happen with intellectual freedom. So this has long been an issue within librarianship, but I think we are seeing today why supporting that principle makes a difference. We really eschew paternalism within librarianship. We teach each person who comes up to the desk as their own individual who has their own information needs. And that's something that is not always easy to do. Sometimes we don't like those people who come up to the desk, but that is part of the job.
Thank you, Emily. We have an anonymous person that wrote in and asked, what is the objection to mouse? They say they don't know anything about it, and it's obviously something that is kind of lingering out there at this moment in time related to this topic.
So I actually read through the entire transcript of the school board that the school board meeting where they objected to mouse and removed it at a 10-0 vote. So the objection to mouse is really about how do we teach history. And for those of you who haven't read Mouse, it is a graphic memoir by Art Spiegelman, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. It's a memoir in 2 parts, and it's really about generational trauma, as so many of these books are actually about generational trauma. It was removed because of several bad words that were included. There's a picture of a woman who has died by suicide and is nude in a bathtub, and also because there are nude mice. Now, he uses the trope of cats versus mice. Cats are Nazis, mice are Jews in the book. But what I really noticed as I read the transcript is actually it comes to this idea of interpretive strategies. Graphic books, so I'll just say graphic novels because that's what people say, actually require a different type of reading practice. So they don't really operate like novels or like picture books. And what I could tell from their reading is that they didn't quite understand what this book was. They couldn't see, what they asked for was that it be sanitized. So they had actually started with redaction, with marking through bad words, which is very odd if you think about it, right? The idea that like Nazis were calling Jews bad words in the Holocaust, that definitely happened, right? What is the point of sanitizing these words? But this actually goes to this particular type of interpretive strategy of what we might call clean books. There's nothing wrong with clean books. There are lots of publishing houses that do clean books. But is it appropriate to expect a book on the Holocaust to be a so-called clean book? So that's really what I saw, was this idea that it was really, to me, like a lack of understanding of what the purpose of the book was, what Art Spiegelman was trying to say about himself and his interactions with his father. That's a book I commend to anybody to read. It's quite difficult and bracing. He does not paint his father in the best light. His father is a Holocaust survivor. He's also extremely racist at the same time. But it is beautiful, and I really recommend that people read Mouse.
Emily, you've kind of, I won't say made a comparison to the movie industry, but you've mentioned some of those pieces from time to time during our hour here. We had a person ask, obviously movies have a rating, right? So why not do something along those lines with books, or is that done in a certain way right now, just maybe not as publicly?
So I really commend everyone to see This Movie Is Not Yet Rated, which talks about the ratings board for the motion picture industry. So the ratings are voluntary, and they are also extremely subjective. That documentary goes into how things like female nudity is rated versus male nudity, how different people who are in marginalized communities are portrayed, and why that will give you a higher rating as opposed to a lower rating. Labeling is really allowing others to put a categorization, so I talked about symbolic violence, on a particular material. You're actually saying, these people know what I think is right, and I'm going to go with that. Now, there are some places where that makes sense. Libraries do it in some ways. They do divide books from picture books to juvenile, to young adult, to adult. So that actually already happens. The question is, who is the intended audience for that material? And that's where we run into trouble. Because the intended audience are the people who should actually be able to see this, and that's often what challengers are trying to do, is remove it from the intended audience. This happens every so often with motion pictures. So, you know, you'll hear about they had to take some sort of blood out of a movie because it was going to get an R rating, and they wanted to have a PG-13 because it was make more money. Well, that tells you who is making those decisions. Who is the director making those decisions? Probably not. Why are those decisions being made? For very capitalist reasons. Are they really showing the art that the director wants to show? And when you talk about art, you move into the realm of film, which is why some directors will not submit their work to the ratings board.
We had a question come in from Carol. She talks about, or she asks, I suppose, if challengers are successful in removing or getting books banned from a library, how often do those challengers then move on to bookstores to try to get it banned in that realm? Do you have a sense for that?
Yeah, so not so much in bookstores. Bookstores have a different place within our society, so it's very exciting that we now have our independent bookstore here in Urbana-Champaign, lit, and they don't necessarily move on to bookstores. What people tend to do in bookstores is simply complain about a display, not so much that the book is on sale, but that it's been highlighted or platformed, if you've heard that word. And that is where the complaints come. But it's not so much that people talk about like boycotting a bookstore because they see bookstores as capitalist enterprises. That actually shows you the difference between a public library, public school, and a bookstore. A public library or public school are symbols of the values of the community. A bookstore, sort of, but it's also much more related to the people who own the store themselves.
We've had 2 or 3 folks ask in the comments and in the Q&A how they can help fight against book banning, or how do they support their local libraries. We had someone tuning in from Wyoming. Thank you for tuning in from that far away. That's the beauty of Zoom, I suppose. But they said they have board members that are resigning from their local library because of the ongoing challenges. So any thoughts around that?
Run for library board. That's one thing you can do, but you can also simply show up to the meetings. Make sure that the director knows that you support the library. Keep checking things out, even if it's just online. I mostly use our libraries online for Hoopla, and Overdrive. I also would ask you to consider supporting organizations. So the American Library Association Office for Intellectual Freedom does this work. The National Coalition of Teachers of English, which is also located here in Urbana, does this work. I'm on the board of the National Coalition Against Censorship, which has its Kids Right to Read project. These are all places where you can learn more. You can actually just learn more about this work. They, of course, take financial donations, but even more importantly, if you're interested in supporting, this is the best way to do it. But showing up can actually be the most important thing. And especially if you have children who have read these books, their testimony is the most important. That's really what all these fights are about. They're about the next generation, what our society will look like in the next few years. Having kids speak out about the book is just one of the best things you can possibly do, because these books are for these kids, and it's very important.
Absolutely. And we have enough questions to probably go for another hour, but we are coming up on time. So I'll ask you one final one, and I think it's brief, but it may have a more extensive answer. Sandy wrote in and asked, what is your personal favorite banned book?
Oh.
Is this something we might need to think about this for a while? We can get back to everyone if we need to.
Oh, I have so many. I'm actually going to go a little nostalgic on this. And it's not a book I've read recently, but Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret is my favorite banned book, because getting introduced to the naturalistic fiction of Judy Blume really set me on my path for thinking about, what does it mean to write meaningful fiction for kids that some people think is actually too naturalistic. And I had the pleasure of serving with Judy Blume on the board of the National Coalition Against Censorship. I didn't get to meet her in person, but I would sometimes get emails from her just replying to something that we were working on. And it was just hard not to fangirl in my office, just being so excited. She owns a bookstore now. So I think I'm going to say that book, but actually the books on the list right now, a lot of these books are just incredible. I encourage you to read them, to buy them for your kids, to donate them. Often the books that are challenged are really great books. So sometimes The Grapes of Wrath shows on there. If you haven't read The Grapes of Wrath in a while, give it a try. It's a great book. So I think I'll say, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret.
Sounds wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to listen to your presentation and to spend a little time with you through the Q&A. We thank you for your time. Thank you all for attending this evening. We do have our next session actually in just a couple short weeks here. March 7th, we will go in a different direction. We're going to have a university update featuring our Fighting Illini football head coach, Brett Bielema, heading into his second season with the football team. And he will give a program update, talk a little bit about recruiting, spring practice, what to expect this fall. And again, that'll take place on March 7th at 6 p.m. I think the email marketing for that dropped today, so you should have all received that. If not, be sure to go to UIAA.org. You can sign up on our website. But again, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you again to Dr. Knox. It's been an absolutely wonderful hour, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Stay safe and stay well, and have a great night.